This is a color mixing demo for your CMYK subtractive color chart. You can see here my sketchbook with 3 overlapping circles. I have my primary cyan, my primary magenta, and I have 3 different yellows, none of which are the same primary yellow that you have, which might make our results slightly different. I'm choosing my just plain yellow. I have my brush, I have water, and perhaps most importantly, I have paper towels. You definitely need paper towels. So I'm going to start with yellow in my mixing dish. And you'll see that you only need a very small amount of yellow. I'm only going to add a really small amount of yellow to the mixing dish. And you should really experiment with dilution with water. So I'm going to show you first here that you can use the paint unthinned. Um, and this is me painting with unthinned gouache. Um, if you don't thin it, it's harder to work with and harder to mix. So I kind of have 3 different dilutions here, unthinned, thinned with water, and then more thinned with water, and then I dab it with the paper towel, and you can see what happens. You get a very light yellow. So you can start by filling out one of your larger sections, which I'm doing here. And you'll remember from my intro, like super fast intro to color theory lecture, um, that subtractive color actually means a mixing of materials. So additive color has to do with mixing light, subtractive color has to do with mixing materials. Um, and with subtractive color mixing, you the more different colors you add together or pigments, the your result is ultimately theoretically black, um, because you're absorbing more and more of the visible spectrum with your material. So you can move on to your next color. And for me, this is the magenta. And again, I'm going to show you what it looks like unthinned, not using the medium of water. And then with a little bit of water, you can see becomes a little bit brighter. And then more water, um, and dabbing with paper towel makes a very light magenta, um, almost a tint, right? Where you could read it as a tint. So I'm aiming here in my circles, especially for these primaries, um, for coverage that feels pretty opaque. And that means that these are not going to read like they're kind of transparent or sheer washes of color. They're going to read like opaque solids. Um, you guys are using the primary CMYK gouache set, because, again, as you'll know from the Intro to Color Theory Quick and Dirty lecture, this is a print color space. Um, and that means that when you're using, any kind of print process, um, mechanical print process, like using a printer, the inks will be CMYK. And when they are added together, you can get a really vast range of colors, layering them in different orders. So I also, I'm going to use cyan now and paint that last area. And again, note, I'm using really small amounts of paint, right? You really only need a very small amount of gouache. And you can test out the color saturation here again through the addition of water. So this is thinned with water and then more thinned with water. And the cyan has pretty strong tinting strength. So I took it down a lot with water. Um, Note how the unthinned gouache reads as darker and more matte. Um, this is because less light is reflecting through it from the white of the paper. And you could really almost say that that those kind of most dilute colors on the far right of that column that I made there, that they read either as, kind of light versions, like diluted with white or tints. Um, so this means like contextually you could push that, like, is this a light blue color or is this a cyan tint? Meaning that we understand that this is kind of sheer and transparent and not an opaque. Um, you could kind of push that reading contextually by what you put around it. So I'm trying to, again, this I think reads as a little bit still sheer, so I'm trying to, or transparent, so I'm trying to make it look a little bit more opaque, um, with just a little more uh, gouache. And then I'm showing you here that you can mix directly on your paper. You can try and mix your colors directly on the paper, but for the most precision and to make use of the luminosity of your paper, you'll get the most accurate results by pre-mixing your colors. So here I'm adding, kind of just layering yellow directly on top of the cyan, and you'll see that it's not mixing perfectly. It mixed a little bit better with the kind of more transparent washes. Um, and so now I'm going to start trying to mix that secondary green. Um, the interaction of the cyan and the yellow make a really broad range of greens, and I'm going to aim for achieving one that feels like the midpoint of that range. So you can see here that kind of mixing separately already gives you a more uniform color, and it's kind of more convincing as its own green and less as a mixture of the cyan and the yellow. But I'm pretty sure I decide that this is too light, not at the midpoint. So I'm going to mix up a few more greens here, pushing my range of hues around through the addition of more cyan or more yellow. So you can really push this into kind of like a teal range. And I'm pretty sure I decide here that that green, particularly layered on top of this original green, will read as more of like a rich, saturated midpoint green. Now, the cyan and the yellow secondary midpoint should be an orange, but it could also be read as like a red orange, or, in some kind of charts that you might see, it'll really be a kind of like a true red. So that's really interesting about, yellow and magenta, right? So I kind of veer into, at first, I think, a pretty bright red, and then I take it down with more yellow into an orange. And again, I'm trying to aim for like a convincing midpoint. Um, So this is definitely what I land on here is pretty red right now. Um, so I'm gonna push it back a little bit to an orange. It's also thinned down. So again, you get the white coming through from behind, which tones it down and allows you to read it as a lighter orange. And maybe decided here that was a little too light, so add another layer. This is something you can do with kind of thin down gouache. If you were using oil paint or acrylic paint, it would be called glazing. With kind of water-based media on paper, it's called washes. And I'm also going to show you mixing unthinned magenta and unthinned yellow and how that reads, which is it's a little bit trickier. First of all, of course, magenta has a higher tinting strength than the yellow. Um, so it's going to take more yellow, obviously, in proportion to magenta to get the color that we want. It's not a 50-50 ratio that's going to get us to a midpoint visually. And that's something really important to learn, uh, you know, about kind of working with color in theory and in practice. Uh, Theoretically, there's a midpoint, which would maybe be like in a recipe form, 50-50, but actually visually to achieve that, it's not exactly this proportion. So now I'm going to mix that magenta and cyan. And, magenta and cyan are really interesting because it can yield anywhere from a really deep blue um, to a rich purple to kind of, these secondary fuchsia and violets. And I decide, okay, I think I hit this midpoint um, purple. But I will kind of show you the directions that cyan and magenta can go. And that'll be really useful for you actually as you do your desaturation charts to remember that some of those blues um, that you see actually are going to come from uh, cyan and magenta, these very bright kind of what we might read as like a royal blue um, or kind of an ultramarine blue. So there you can see I'm pushing it into maybe more of like a violet range. And this becomes more of like a true blue. And we can even go a little deeper with the purple. And I think I decided, okay, I like that deeper purple, more blue purple, which again makes it look more saturated, less like a tint and more like a saturated solid. And there we have our kind of completed primary and secondary colors. And now we can test whether our secondary colors are truly midpoints by mixing them together and see if they desaturate to a neutral, gray, or, black, which they do. You can see there that in the center, it's really this kind of very gray, not too warm, not too cold. So I'm going to try and mix a larger amount of a desaturated neutral for the middle. And you'll see that I'm going to work my way through a real variety of interesting browns, and then move into cooler grays. So this will also be useful to you for those desaturation charts to know kind of what direction, how, kind of like how to push things, how to push your browns and grays towards desaturation. I'm getting these really interesting kind of siennas or golden colors, and then it does start to get cooler, um, meaning reading is as less warm and more gray, particularly with the white visible through it. So with the translucency of the wash, this looks very green, but on paper reads as kind of a more like cool gray. And I decided that I want this to be much darker. It's still a very sheer wash. So I start adding sort of the straight magenta and the straight cyan eventually. But I'm really, yeah, I just sort of decide, okay, let's go for it. Um, I'm really trying to get kind of as dark, the K, the key color, it's technically supposed to be black. I'm really trying to get as close to black as I can. Um, of course, it will be here because of the amount of water I've used. It'll still read as more gray. Um, and you can also see how kind of continued mixing helps push the color. So I think I decided, oh, that's still a little too warm. Let's add some more green and cyan. Now we're getting somewhere. And it's really helpful when you're mixing, and you should feel free to do what I'm doing, make these little swatches. It's really helpful to see things, of course, again, contextually. Color is uh, very contextual if there's one thing that we'll learn. And um, so you really kind of understand how a color is acting in relation to other colors. So some of these earlier grays that I mixed might, read as very, very neutral until you see them next to cooler grays, and then they might read as very warm. Um, so yeah, that was the key here was trying to find a desaturated middle color that didn't read as either brown or kind of too greenish, um, and red as kind of a neutral midpoint. I think I'm going to decide that that's still too light and go back over it again. And I'm also going to show you trying to mix directly um, a neutral right on the paper and why maybe it's not ideal, though still can be done, but um, just trickier in terms of paint usage and getting a, a true color that you can work with repeatedly. So that's it. That's your color demo.